Last week, I'm going to tell you right off the bat that today's message is two parts. We're going to start it today. We're going to finish it next week. Next week, we're going to pause on the Gospel of Luke, and we're going to enter into these rhythms of spiritual disciplines with prayer, fasting, and a few other teachings. And then we're going to pick up and finish Luke right before Easter and right after Easter. And but last week, we talked about Jesus, what he was saying about the resurrection and what he was saying about marriage. This week is Jesus on his return. There are so many voices in the world today. There are so many voices clamoring for our attention, giving us their input, giving us their opinion on a variety of things. And I'm so grateful for the time that I've been able to dig into the Gospel of Luke to really see what is Jesus saying. So I called last week's sermon, Jesus on Marriage and the Resurrection. Not the world on marriage, not the world on divorce, but Jesus. Jesus on his return. All right? And so we're going to spend the next 2 Sundays looking at that. And one thing that I've actually started to do as I prepare a message is I've started to, this year, I hand write. I have an A4 journal, just lines, nothing on it. I just write the date, I write, a sermon title or the passage, and I hand write the passage that I'm going to preach on. And what it's done for me is it's caused me to slow down, and I see things in the passage that I miss when I am just reading it. And I actually was challenged this morning that I might need to actually start writing the words of God or Jesus in a different color similar to the Bible to really just even get me to pause of what is Jesus saying or what is God saying on a particular issue. All right, and so it's just this time where we slow down. Maybe in these 21 days of prayer and fasting, it's a time for us to slow down. God, what are you saying? What words are you leading us by? Your words, not the world's, not my ideas, not our opinions, but what are you saying? So we're going to talk about Jesus on his return. We're in Luke chapter 21. Before we get there, just one more slide up there. It was like a few weeks ago, this isn't the first time Jesus talked about his return or talks about what we call the end times. He refers to it often and frequently throughout his 3 years of ministry. But a few weeks ago from Luke chapter 17, verses 22 to 37, Jesus also talked about, you can go to the next slide, and it said that some summary points from that, you can go back and listen to it on YouTube. Thank you. That Jesus' return will be unmistakable. Jesus' return will be unpredictable. Jesus' return will be unescapable, meaning everybody will be impacted. Jesus' return is inevitable. It is providential. It is God's timing and God's hand in human history that Jesus will return. And Jesus' return will feel delayed, and it will be a test of our devotion to him. Sarah and I talk about, why don't we know? Why didn't he tell us exactly when he would return? And we could surmise about that, but we know that Jesus is pretty clear. We're going to hear it again today, that we don't know the day or the hour. But imagine if you did know the day or the hour. Have you ever had to wait for something, but you're waiting for something, but you know the day and the hour that what you're waiting for is going to happen? It affects how you live. It affects what you do in those minutes or those hours or those days leading up to the thing you've been waiting for. If I knew when Jesus can return, it might impact how I live. I might become complacent, entitled, or a bit lazy. I am a Minnesota Vikings fan day in and day out because I am waiting for the day they get to the Super Bowl. I don't know when that'll be, but it gets me every year watching them, hoping, waiting, anticipating, all right? But I don't know, okay? But Jesus' return is coming, and the waiting for it is a test of our devotion to him. So let's pick up Luke chapter 21. If you have the Gospel of Luke, it's going to be on page 155. We're going to start in verse 5. I'm going to read bits and pieces of this, and then we're going to pause, and we're just going to look at it a little bit more closely. Now, this is Luke chapter 21. Jesus had just commented on a poor widow giving so much in the temple, out of actually so little of what she had in the temple. He was amazed by what she was giving, by her sacrifice. And coming out of that, this is what the disciples say. Now, keep in mind that for the past several weeks, we have been listening to Jesus' teaching. This is his final week on earth. It is the days leading up to his crucifixion. He is hitting on some really key topics and some important things, really challenging his disciples. But after this chapter, we go to Luke 22. That is when he will have his last supper with his disciples. One of his closest friends and disciples, Judas, will actually betray him and turn him over to the religious and political authorities. And so this is it. Some argue that this is actually his final teaching, his final speech even, that possibly this happened on Wednesday before Thursday, which was the Last Supper. And so they're leaving the temple, watching this woman who just gave out of what she didn't have. We're going to pick it up in verse 5. It says, some of his disciples began talking about the majestic stonework of the temple and the memorial decorations on the walls. But Jesus said, the time is coming when all of these things will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another. Teacher, they asked, when will all of this happen? What sign will show us that these things are about to take place? Now we're going to pause there. The temple was enormous. The temple that the disciples saw and knew was an expansion of the second temple that Israel, or God had Israel build. In the Old Testament, the original temple as built by King Solomon was eventually destroyed in 586 BC. It was a complete desolation, a complete destruction of the temple. It was rebuilt some 70 or so years later. And in the book of Haggai, it says that when they rebuilt the temple, some of those who remembered the previous temple cried when they saw the second temple because it was smaller in comparison and less magnificent than the first temple. When the first temple was constructed, the presence of God came upon the temple in a mighty cloud, in a storm. It was very powerful moment. When the second temple was built, there was no such presence of God manifest coming down in these clouds. In fact, it was said that the glory that will come to that temple will be greater. Prophesying that when baby Jesus was presented in the temple, that was the greater glory of God coming. But King Herod and some of the other kings began to expand this temple. There were offerings that people had given to the temple. It was just beautiful. It was decorative. It was ornate. It was a magnificent wonder. So his disciples are admiring the temple and it's like magnificent. But Jesus indicates that the coming judgment of Israel, or the coming, judgment on God's people, is going to include the destruction of the temple. And it would be inconceivable for his disciples, for Jews of that day, to imagine a destruction that God would allow that would include the destruction of the temple. Unimaginable. This is, I'm going to paraphrase from one of the commentaries, Matthew Henry. This is what he says. He said, some admired the temple's outward splendor, even Christ's own disciples, pointing out its beautiful stones, its costly decorations. They expected Jesus to share their admiration and to mourn its destruction as they did. But what of us? When we speak of the temple, we should speak of God's presence. We should speak of his appointed worship. We should speak of the fellowship his people have with him. And similarly today, it is a shallow thing for us to focus on the church and its splendor, its outward show, its wealth, or the power of its leaders. The temple was meant to represent God's presence with his people. The presence of the temple, the presence of a church building does not offer the protection, the safety, the eternal salvation that Jesus offers in relationship with him. We're going to do a little study. Go back to Jeremiah chapter 7. Before there was a temple, there was a tabernacle. Before the temple was in Jerusalem, the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant was in a place called Shiloh. In Jeremiah chapter 7, Jeremiah has been called as a spokesperson for God, called as a prophet. And he says in chapter 7, verse 2, he says to Jeremiah, stand at the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim this message. Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah, who come through these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the alien, the fatherless, or the widow, do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place. Verse 8, but look, you are trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, perjury, burn incense to Baal, follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house which bears my name? It's like an exercise of futility. You come into the temple, you offer your sacrifices, you come into the supposed presence of the Lord, into the house of the Lord that bears his name, but then you go out and you cheat and you steal and you rob and you commit adultery and you do all these things that goes against the ways of God. And you think, oh, the temple, but the temple, but the temple. As long as the temple is here, we're good. God says no. He says no. He says that right there. He says, we are safe to do all these detestable things? As believers, we're not given the safety to do things that are contrary to the ways of God. In fact, in Isaiah, God at one point even says to the Israelites, I hate the feasts and the worship that you practice. And these are the feasts and the worship that God gave the Israelites to do. He hated it because of their misplaced hearts, their idolatry, their misplaced devotion, their duplicity. He says in verse 12, now go to the place in Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people. Now, what happened in Shiloh? To understand that, you need to go to 1 Samuel chapter 4. This was before the temple was built. This was before any of the kings. It's in the time of the judges still. 1 Samuel chapter 4. And in Shiloh was the tabernacle, and in Shiloh is where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. 1 Samuel 4, chapter 4, verse 1, it says, Samuel's word came to all of Israel. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. Now they had no king at this time. God was their king. When the Israelites would fall into idolatry and sin, God would raise up a deliverer as the people of Israel cried out to God and repented to amend their ways, and he would come and deliver them. So, and oftentimes the oppressing nation or the oppressing people group was the Philistines. And it says that the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. And the Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. And when the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? Why has this calamity come upon us? Why has this destruction come upon us? What is going on? So this was their solution. Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh so that it may go with us and save us from the hands of our enemies. The Ark of the Covenant was there to remind the people, as was the tabernacle. The tabernacle was reminding people of God's presence. The Ark of the Covenant was reminding them of the covenant, the promises that God made with them, and their promises of blessings and their promises of God's presence with them was connected to their obedience. The 10 Commandments were placed in the covenant. They bring it out of the tabernacle, and they treat it what looks to be like a little bit of a chess game pawn, a magical token, thinking we've lost because we need God's presence with us. Let's bring the Ark of the Covenant out. This is verse 4, so the people sent men to Shiloh. They brought back the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord Almighty, who was enthroned between the cherubim. So on the top of the Ark of the Covenant was this cover, 2 cherubim with their wings pointed forward, and that's where the presence of God would come and meet with the high priest. Okay, again, it's representative, but it is a place where God's presence would come down. But it's not a token. It's not an idol. It's not a good luck charm. It's not something you carry in your pocket. It's a reminder. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. When the Ark of the Lord's covenant came to the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. And hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What is all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" And when the Philistines, learned that the Ark of the Covenant had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid, saying, "A god has come into the camp," they said. "We're in trouble. Nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us! Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the deserts. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. And it says that Israel lost 30,000 soldiers. And to top it off, the Ark of the Covenant was captured and lost. What's my point in bringing this up? The disciples were so enamored by the temple, they couldn't possibly imagine a day of its destruction. We don't trust in the temple. You know, we trust in God and our faith in Him, knowing the truth of who God is, the truth of who Jesus is, and what He came to do. Shiloh was the religious center for Israel in the times of Judges. But despite having the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, God allowed it to be taken. It was misused. It was misunderstood. And so in the same way, that temple in Jesus' day wasn't the protection for Israel. Yeah, sure, the Romans let the temple stand until about 30 years later. Yeah, they didn't really mind it as long as the Jews didn't cause any troubles in their community, or the Christians later. But it wasn't something to save them. It was, that would be destroyed. What was most important was that we endure in our relationship and our faith with Jesus Christ. In fact, Jesus is going to tell His disciples that they need to endure till the very end. Within 24 to 48 hours, He is going to be killed. They're going to be scattered. And unfortunately, one of His closest disciples, Judas, does not endure till the end. He betrays Jesus and takes his own life. Peter denies Jesus, but then repents. Like, there is calamity, there's hardship coming that they cannot imagine. Now, this temple, if you keep going, was eventually destroyed in AD 70, just 30-some years after Jesus died and rose again. And this temple was, it was interesting how this happened. So when Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple, no stone being left on top of each other, it's highly likely that He was talking about the destruction of the temple this time. It's never been rebuilt. You go to Jerusalem now, there's no temple. There's a foundation stone, there's a wailing wall, and there's a mosque sitting on top of it. It is not the temple of God. So Rome took control of Israel in 63 BC. And around after Jesus' day, there was a series of uprisings by the Jews. There was Judas the Galilean, as spoken of in Acts 5. He led an uprising because of a tax census by Quirinius, that dude in Luke, okay, in AD 6. In AD 38, there were local Egyptians in Alexandria that rioted against Jews. Why? Because the Jews refused to honor the Emperor Caligula, and the Emperor Caligula eventually ordered a statue of himself to be built in the Temple of Jerusalem. And tensions ensued. A couple hundred years earlier, it was Antiochus Epiphanes who actually went into the temple and desecrated it by putting an altar of Zeus there. So these Jewish uprisings in Jesus' day led to what's called the first Jewish revolt against Rome in AD 66 to 70. First, revolutionaries attacked Jews that were loyal to Rome. They temporarily eliminated Rome from the region. In response, Emperor Nero sent his commander Vespasian to put down the rebellion with an army of 60,000 Roman soldiers. When Vespasian became emperor in AD 69, he gave military control to his son Titus. Titus laid siege to Jerusalem in the spring of AD 70. Within months, the city fell, the temple was destroyed, and the victory is commemorated by erecting the Titus Arch, which you can still see in Rome today. And we've seen it. It's unbelievable. Commemorating the destruction of Jerusalem. This is how one historian put it. Roman soldiers erected scaffolds around the walls of the temple and its buildings, filled them with wood and other flammable material, and set them on fire. The intense heat from the fires caused the stones to crumble. And then eventually a soldier threw another burning brand into the temple itself, consuming the entire building. Then after it was all dismantled and sifted through, they found all the melted gold. The rubble was thrown into the Kidron Valley. Only the huge foundation stones remain largely intact. But they are not part of the temple itself. They simply support the retaining walls. And that is what we see today. So the disciples asked Jesus, well, when will these things happen? So then Jesus gives them signs. Now, you have to understand that Jews in Jesus' day had an idea of what the end time or what the Messiah coming would look like. It has been 3 years of the disciples with Jesus, and Jesus had not done what the disciples expected the Messiah to do, namely display his glory, judge Israel's enemies, and establish the promised kingdom of which Israel will be the centerpiece. That is not happening. There is disappointment. So instead what Jesus does is he gives 3 signs, 3 general signs of what to expect between now, their day, when he's going to die and ascend, and his return. So we're going to pick that up in Luke chapter 21, verses 8 through, I think it's 19. It's on page 156 in the gospel. Jesus replied, the question, what will be the signs that this is happening? Don't let anyone mislead you. For many will come in my name, claiming, I am the Messiah, and saying the time has come. But don't believe them. And when you hear of wars and insurrections, don't panic. Yes, these things must take place first, but the end won't follow immediately. Then he added, nation will go to war against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes. There will be famines and plagues in many lands, and there will be terrifying things and great miraculous signs from heavens. But before all of this occurs, there will be a time of great persecution. You will be dragged into synagogues, prisons. You will stand trial before kings and governors because you are my followers. But this will be your opportunity to tell them about me. So do not worry in advance about how to answer the charges against you, for I will give you the right words and such wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to reply or refute you. Even those closest to you, your parents, brothers, relatives, friends, will betray you. They will even kill some of you, and everyone will hate you because you are my followers. But not a hair of your head will perish. By standing firm, you will win souls. So Jesus gives 3 areas of signs that they can expect between then and his return. 1 being there will be imposters and misleaders. 2, calamities and catastrophes. 3, persecutions and oppression. The only thing is, it took a lot longer than most of them, or probably any of us, expected. So what about the imposters and misleaders? Jesus says that there will be false prophets, there will be false teachers, and history has shown us since the days of Jesus that there have been false messiahs and false teachers and false prophets all over the world. There were false messiahs showing up in the first couple of 100 years from Jesus' death, promising to part rivers and seas, promising to command city walls to come down, inspiring uprisings. And as they inspired these uprisings in the false name of the Messiah, not only were they killed, but many of their followers were killed. But Luke says, if you go back to Luke 17, verse 22, he says, if we are longing to see his return, then Christ's return will be clear. It'll be unmistakable. We don't have to be worried about being led astray by these false teachers. In fact, Matthew says it this way in chapter 24, verse 23 to 26. It says, Jesus warns to not believe anyone who says, here is the Christ, because the coming of the Son of Man will be as evident as lightning in the sky. It will be unmistakable. But he says, false Christs, false prophets will arise, this is interesting, performing great signs and wonders to lead people astray. But Jesus says, but see, I have told you beforehand, so you will know, so you don't have to worry, so you won't be caught off guard. This takes us all the way back to Moses in front of Pharaoh. When Moses was turning a staff into a snake, turning water into blood. The magicians of Pharaoh did the same miracles that Moses did. Read the text carefully. And it wasn't until they couldn't replicate one of those plagues that the magicians of Pharaoh said, this is the hand of Yahweh. To lead people astray. Don't be amazed by signs and wonders just because they're signs and wonders. This is what another commentary says. So Jesus says, don't go after them. The road that a lot of them follow is that wide road that leads where? To destruction. It's not the narrow road that goes through the narrow door. Brody preached a message on this several weeks ago. So what Warren Wiersbe in his commentary says, do not be deceived. That is our Lord's admonition. We must take it to heart. The only sure way to keep our balance in a deceptive world is to know the scriptures and obey what God tells us to do. It is foolish and hurtful to become so obsessed with things like biblical prophecy that we start to neglect the practical things of the Christian life. He says, blessed are the balanced. So many voices, so many opinions. What is Jesus saying? You know, this week we had the opportunity to go wakeboarding and wake surfing on the river, and all the kids got up. I got up. Sarah got up. We all got up. All right. And I was watching Julia get up, and, you know, like everyone by the time Julia gets up is like coaching her how to do it. Probably like 8 people on the boat coaching her how to do it. But she focused on Matt's voice because Matt owned the boat. Matt knew how to do this, and you could just see her, boom, I'm going to focus in on that voice. I'm not going to be led astray by these other ideas. I'm going to do it. And she did it. She got up. We got to focus on Jesus' voice. Let's go to 2 Peter chapter 3. Told you there was a lot in here. Now I just got to find 2 Peter. 2 Peter, it's after 1 Peter. This is right after First Delusions. 1 Peter chapter 3, that's what he says. Verse 17. I'm sorry, 2 Peter. Yeah, thank you. Not even in the right book. See how easily we can be led? I could have been reading from 1 Peter 3:17. You guys have been like, doesn't make sense, but I'll trust him. No. 2 Peter 3:17. Therefore, dear friends, since you already know this, be on your guard so that you may not be carried away by the error of lawless men and fall from your secure position, but grow in the grace and the knowledge of our Lord Savior Jesus Christ. To him be the glory both now and forever. Amen. Know Jesus, know the word, know ahead of time, know how to advance. Jesus' return will be clear. You're not going to miss it if you're alive in those days. But then he says, look, there's going to be calamities and catastrophes. But he says that these calamities and catastrophes, these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once. Wars. History has shown us that from the time of Jesus Christ to AD 1000, there were 50 significant wars recorded in the world. From the year 1000 to 1500, there were 100 significant wars in the world. From 1500 to 1800, there were 250 significant wars. And from 1800 through till today, or at least when this scholar wrote, which was like 2004, there were 500 significant wars. War has been increasing in the world. 75 million people died in World War I and World War II. The book of Revelation says that when there's worldwide war, famine, disease, that 25% of the earth's population will die. By comparison, 3% of the world's population died in World War II. It's staggering. But these wars end when Jesus returns. It ends when he establishes his kingdom. Earthquakes. Since the 1930s and the invention of the Richter scale, 35 earthquakes with a magnitude of 8.5 or greater. Earthquakes throughout history have killed hundreds of thousands of people at one time, including in 1556, 830,000 people died in China from one earthquake. Plagues, pestilence, epidemics, smallpox, measles, bubonic plague. The bubonic plague, known as Black Death, from 1346 to 1353, killed 1/3 to 1/5 of Europe's population, 20 to 50 million people. Famines. Famines are common throughout history. In fact, China alone has had at least 1,800 famines. 95 famines in Britain since the Middle Ages. Famines today because of corruption and military conflict. In fact, that a long, severe famine is what helped contribute the collapse of the great Mayan civilization. Terrors, other catastrophic events such as wildfires, landslides, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions. We were up to the volcano in Hawaii several years ago when it was erupting, not the Kilauea, Mauna Loa. It is one of the most magnificent, terrible sights you will ever see, to see these volcanoes erupting. And then Jesus talks about there will be signs from heaven. There is a lot of speculation. I mean, in those days, they're probably thinking about, what are those falling stars? What are those comets? What are the hailstorms? What are the tornadoes? What are the hurricanes? What's the flooding? What's the rain? Some people are like, oh, that's nuclear war. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, if it is. Okay, there's a lot of there's no way to couch the words of Jesus in a really comforting way. Do not overlook that Jesus said wars, earthquakes, pestilence, and famines by themselves are not the signs of his soon returns. These things have been going on throughout human history, but we're getting closer. And then finally, we're going to end here. He says you can expect persecution and oppression. In Luke 12, this is from Luke 21 from verses 12 to 19, he says that they will lay their hands on you, but this will be your opportunity to bear witness. Now, for the apostles, they were arrested, they were delivered before synagogues, they were tried, they were beaten, they were imprisoned, they were brought before kings and governors. Jews brought them into prison, their own countrymen brought them into prison. Being brought before the synagogue was to be publicly shamed and imprisoned, often beaten, flogged. Stephen was arrested, tried, and executed at the hands of religious leaders. Paul, although not one of the 12, bore witness before governors, before Caesar, and showing that the pattern Jesus predicted would happen. And suffering became the means in which the gospel was publicly proclaimed. In fact, the greater the persecution in human history, the greater the proclamation of the gospel, the greater the depth of the commitment to Jesus. When wars have shut down the world and not allowed people to travel, or persecution has ensued, what has often resulted is a depth of devotion to Jesus Christ. When Constantine made Christianity legal, devotion to Jesus became more superficial. After hundreds of years of persecution, Nero blamed Christians for the fire in Rome in AD 64. He arrested Christians, tortured them, threw them to wild animals, crucified them, and burned them as human candles in his garden. Under Emperor Decius, persecution continued, and under Diocletian in AD 303, he tried to exterminate Christianity, burned churches, burned Bibles, and killed believers. And then eventually in the Middle Ages, even the Inquisitions were Christians killed by Christians. And it's estimated that since 1990, 100,000 Christians have been killed every year. Nigeria, places in Africa. Suffering has purified the church, the gospel has spread. And as Tertullian, who wrote in the 2nd century, the more often we are mowed down by you, the persecutors, the more in number we grow. The blood of Christians is seed. It was the Polycarp. And then Jesus said, do not prepare beforehand to defend yourselves. Jesus will give you the utterance and the wisdom. Polycarp, bishop of Smyrna in the 2nd century, said this, being faced with death. 86 years have I served Jesus. He never did me any injury. How can I blaspheme my King and Savior? Much later, the Czech reformer John Hus, as he is getting ready to be burned at the stake, said, the Lord Jesus Christ, my Redeemer, was bound with a harder chain. I am but a miserable sinner, And I am not afraid to bear this one, bound as I am for his name's sake. In the name's sake. And in the same truth of the gospel which I have written, taught, and preached, drawing upon the sayings and positions, I am ready to die today. Jesus says you'll be hated and persecuted for his name's sake. You know, this week in Australia, there's legislation getting ready to be voted on. It's called hate speech protection legislation. But if you look at it closely, they hate the speech of Christians. If you look at it closely and you start to listen to people who are unpacking this law and why it's all of a sudden hitting a little bit of a road bump, there's actually an anti-Christian, silencing of Christian thread coming through it. Canada has done it. The UK has tried to do it. It was pushed back. We can stand in this church and we can exalt Jesus Christ, but will we exalt him in the public marketplace? There's wisdom that is needed. It's one thing to say, I will stand here and I'll exalt you here, Jesus, and that you're worthy. But is he worthy of our lives outside of here? Will we not love our lives even until death? It's a very sobering message. I'm an idealist. I really am. It might not sound like it last week and this week, but I am an idealist. But I've been really challenged by studying Jesus' words in this. And really challenged by some of the Old Testament prophecies not yet fulfilled. Because Jesus, AD 70 came and went. The temple was destroyed. People were killed. Christians were martyred. But Jesus didn't return. So clearly there's still more to come before he returns. Will we endure? Will you endure? It is like this warning, this encouragement of Jesus to his disciples, to us. Will you endure? Will we exalt him in our personal lives? I mean, if COVID and politics have divided us, how much more will Jesus divide? If COVID and politics and free speech laws have silenced us, what are you going to do? What are we going to do before this starts being acted upon? All right? I suspect, this is not a prophetic word, but the days of comfy Christianity in Australia might be behind us. But Jesus says, by your endurance, he says in Luke 21, 18, 19, not a hair on your head will perish, and by your endurance you will gain your lives. The phrase, hair on your head, that is all through the Bible, and it is a consistent phrase declaring safety and protection. Kings would say, not a hair on your head will be harmed. I will protect you. What Jesus is saying is not a hair on your head, meaning, I will protect you. I will offer you eternal salvation. I will offer you the words to say. It might not mean eternal protection here on this earth. You might go to prison. You might not go to prison. You might die. You might lose your job. You might not. But I will protect you. It is eternal, divine, providential safety and protection. It is eternal protection. It is your salvation. And if you endure, you will gain your life. If you will endure. We're going to have Corey come up and the team. We're going to close in a song. And go back, read this passage. We're going to finish it next week. It's not exactly like, woohoo! No, it's like taking up that cross. Matt Coots gave a powerful message on the cost of discipleship. Metaphorically costs our life, can literally cost our life. But there's a promise that if we endure, our life will be saved.